podcast. I'm Dr. Shamik Chakravarty. I'm a philosopher here at the Alliance School of Liberal Arts, and today I'm with Samuel Day, who's a DPhil scholar at the University of Oxford in one of the subjects I find most fascinating, which is psychology. Hi, Samuel.
Afternoon, Shamik.
How are you doing today?
Really good, yeah. Sadly, it's my last day in Alliance University here in Bangalore, but I've absolutely loved my time here, and so there's kind of a tinge of sadness, but it's a beautiful day outside. I've just done my last lecture, and I love being here, so yeah, it's been a good day.
And how did you find your journey here?
My journey here in terms of my flight on Gulf Air, or my journey here in
Your teaching
more
experience
metaphorically?
at the university?
Sorry, I'm misunderstanding. No, it's been fantastic, yeah. So I've given a series of lectures about, well, my area of interest in experimental psychology, which is facial expressions, emotions, social interaction, that type of stuff, and how we process and integrate social and emotional functioning during our social interactions to improve our relationships and our interactions with other people. But it's been fantastic. I think the students here have been brilliant. I've been teaching undergrads and postgrads. Both of them have been brilliant in slightly different ways, but it's a fantastic course that we've got here on the Liberal Arts course, the Global Leaders Alliance, at least for the postgrads anyway. And we've also had a cultural tour of Karnataka, going around the Hoysala temples last week and Mysore Palace, that type of stuff. As someone, this is my first ever trip to India. It's just been brilliant. I've been treated extremely well. And yeah, as I said, pretty sad to be leaving, but my journey here has been fantastic. And obviously I'd love to come back to India at any time in my life.
Wonderful. So I enjoyed a lot of all your lectures actually.
Yeah, hopefully all of them.
And it was my first exposure to a proper live psychology class. I've taken psychology classes online and read books, but this was my first proper live psychology class. So and it's a fascinating subject. So I was just wondering, what got you into psychology? What got you interested into psychology? And well, even go so far as to do a PhD in it and decide it as a complete career. And
so if I had to say what got me into psychology, I think the classic answer would be, I think most people when you ask them what got them into their subject would be their teachers in school, right? And a big shout out to Miss Bridger back at my school in Buckinghamshire in England, fantastic woman. And we couldn't take psychology at GCSE, which is kind of the exams you do at 16 in England, the UK. So we could only do it at A-level, which is like the exams you take before university. But I took it. I just thought psychology, it sounded interesting. I didn't want to do the classic STEM, science, maths, maths, physics, biology, chemistry. I did well in them, but I didn't really enjoy learning those subjects. And so I thought I'd take psychology. I think it worked better with the other subjects that I was doing. And I started doing psychology, and I absolutely loved it. And I think it was taught very well back in the UK, but also it really did appeal to, I guess, I wouldn't say I'm more inquisitive than other people or anything, but I had always had this idea in the back of my mind. I can remember even as like 3 or 4 years old, in my bedroom, like playing around with my vision. If you stick like a finger in front of your face and you bring it closer, like suddenly you get double vision, for instance, and you're thinking, oh, how is the brain perceiving this? Why am I seeing my finger twice? That type of stuff. And this is obviously not very scientific at all. Like, in fact, this is the first time I've thought about that for years and years. But I was always really fascinated with how we build up the perception of the world around us. So perception, I would say, was the biggest thing. We have all this incoming sensory information from the environment. So over there, we've got the camera and the cameraman behind it. There's you. I can see the colour of your shirt, which is suspiciously close to Cambridge blue for my liking. But anyway, and then we've got depth perception, motion perception, colour perception. We integrate them all together. And I think I was really interested in perception, how the brain puts together all these inputs to have this coherent, constructed creation of the world that we take in and obviously interact with. So I was interested in psychology in that way. Did it at A-level. I got a good grade at A-level, and because I enjoyed it more than the other 2 subjects I took it at A-level, which were, philosophy was one of them. I quickly grew quite sceptical of philosophy, I'm sorry to say, and geography was the other one. So it became a really logical solution. Well, not solution, it wasn't a problem, but it became a logical path for me to study psychology at university. And like I had really encouraging parents and as I said, teachers. They were encouraging me to apply to Oxford, and I went around on the open day. Love Oxford, fantastic city, favourite city in the world. Went around there. I didn't want to be anywhere else. Applied, got in, and I just had the most fantastic few years as undergrad there, apart from COVID kind of interrupting towards the end of it, but whatever, we'll let that slide. Nothing to do with the degree or the subject. And as I said, I loved studying it. You were just learning something new, something fascinating every day. It could be, the visual illusions of the tube train that looks like it's moving in different directions, or like why certain cultures can't say certain phonemes, like the Japanese with letter R, for instance, or stuff more related to like real world issues like clinical psychology, developmental psychology. How do children build up their perception of the world and their understanding of the world? Segment speech, for instance. And I loved it. I loved every second of that degree, pretty much, even though it was quite work intense. So I wanted to take it for postgrad, and I applied for the Masters at Oxford. I really wanted to do that. It was kind of a bit of a continuation of the undergrad course. And then got a big stroke of luck. They had some funding available. Someone asked me, do you want to do a PhD? Thought about it and thought, why not? Let's just do it. I love this subject. And I have a fantastic supervisor back in Oxford, Danielle Shaw. She's on maternity leave now. Congrats to her on her new baby, William. He looks very cute. And I thought, yeah, I've got a fantastic supervisor. This is an area of research. I kind of moved on at this point from being interested in perception. Obviously, this is very shallow of me, but it was just extremely difficult to get your head around some of that stuff. We still have very, very little understanding of how we do that. Very interesting, but like probably too mathsy for my taste. And so I loved learning about social interaction, emotions, that type of stuff. One of my modules in my final year at Oxford as an undergrad was led by Professor Brian Parkinson, who is now the head of the lab that I'm in. He's not my supervisor, but he's the head of the lab. And I loved it. It was my favourite module I think I did at Oxford. It was all about the type of stuff that I've been teaching over the last couple of weeks to the students here at Alliance. Absolutely fantastic. So when I thought about what I wanted to do, that was the thing that leapt out immediately. And I could kind of combine it with certain stuff that my other big influence, Jeff Bird, who was the tutor in my college in Oxford, was interested in. So I thought, yeah, why not? Let's get Danielle. She's fantastic. I knew her beforehand. Let's do something on facial expressions, how we perceive facial expressions, smiles, come up with this question. And here I am now. Yeah, I'm now into my second year of the PhD, and it's been going quite well, I think, hopefully. And yeah, it just the presenting and the research got me involved here because I gave a presentation back in Oxford and it went well, and there was someone there who knew someone here who was like, why don't you come over and do this lecture course? So that's basically how I ended up where I am now, sat at this boardroom in Alliance University in Bangalore.
Great. So here you are, right?
Yeah.
So you touched upon your research.
Mm-hmm.
Now it was on the contextual processing and perception of emotion through faces. And
Not necessarily emotions, more than emotions,
right.
or less than emotions, in fact. It depends on your perspective, but more like, yeah, the role that facial expressions play within social interaction, not necessarily in terms of the emotions they convey, but the other messages. Right. I'm sure we'll come on to that.
Okay, we'll go to
that.
Yeah. Right. So what is the standard view, the mainstream view, against which the sort of research you do, kind of goes against or modifies?
Okay, so every undergraduate student in psychology, I would imagine, has come across this type of research before, and the standard dominant theory, approach, I guess you could say, in affective psychology comes from Paul Ekman, who very famously, he was at the University of California in San Francisco, and in the late 60s and particularly the early 70s, and then for the following decades, he was kind of the big cheese in affective psychology. And he came up with this theory, which, as I said, is probably still the dominant theory in affective psychology, called basic emotions. And he basically hypothesized that we have these 6 basic emotions. Some people have argued exactly how many there are, but 6 is kind of the conventional accepted view, which are happiness as the positive emotion, and then we have anger, disgust, sadness, fear, and surprise. And he basically hypothesized that we have these 6 basic emotions. Each of them have their own distinctive neural activation pattern. They're governed by their own emotion program, is what he called it, which is like a neural program which produces basically this, what's the word that I'm looking for? This correlated, coordinated series of things that are always connected when we experience that emotion. So that's the facial expression, the autonomic or physiological activation of the body, the subjective experience, and of course the brain activation too. And supposedly each of these different emotions are associated with very distinctive, very separable facial expressions, neural activation patterns, physiological activation patterns, and subjective experiences. And this has been the mainstream view. And I guess there's a reason for that. It's extremely intuitive. It kind of chimes with what your average, Joe on the street would think about emotions. And it chimed with what I thought about emotions before I studied it too. It's very intuitive.
Even when I read it the first time, I just, I said, no, this is right. Like,
yeah,
it just
exactly.
seems so right.
Even when I was learning about this back as an undergraduate, I just remember thinking, because well, we haven't even got into the criticisms of it yet, but it does feel right. It feels right, and you try to cling on to the feeling, don't you? And I'm not saying it's wrong as such. And of course, it's been an extremely influential theory. Paul Ekman, of course, putting forward this. He did some very creative research, and maybe there is some element of truth. There's some compromise to be had, but yeah, it does seem to chime with what we think emotions are, at least in like a lay psychology, folk psychology approach or view.
Right, so where's the gap in this research where the sort of research you do on contextual factors,
I guess, is it a gap or is it more a refutation of basic emotions as such? I don't know. There is a gap in what I'm doing, but in order to think about what the gap is, I think you need to have some like historical context to the research. So when Ekman did his research, he mainly had like two avenues where he supported his theory. One of which was when he went to these isolated tribal societies in Papua New Guinea and other parts of the world, where he met, I say met, like he kind of embedded himself within these communities in the highlands of Papua New Guinea, where they'd barely ever seen a white person before, and did a series of experiments about how they recognise facial expressions of emotion. And then the other thing he did was the more physiological stuff, where he was getting people to experience emotions and then measuring like the physiological activity from different parts of the body. And if we go back to the facial expression stuff, at first it appeared that that these people from these tribes who shouldn't, the reason he studied them was because they didn't have any contact with other cultures, and they didn't have like these shared visual sources such as television, magazines, for instance, which would have kind of contaminated or confounded the study. So if we do have these universal basic emotions, they should be found across all of humanity, all of our species, and these people were the perfect people to study because there was no environmental factors that they could have taken, say, from Hollywood or American culture that could have affected how they produce and interpret facial expressions. So he went there, and basically he thought what he found was that they recognized these facial expressions in the same way that Americans and Europeans and Japanese people and African people did. Of course, there are problems with this research, and lots of his conclusions have been strongly criticised, especially by James Russell, who is probably his chief nemesis in affective psychology. They've probably been the two most influential thinkers in this field. And lots of his conclusions have been criticised on methodological grounds, for instance. He didn't really report lots of the stuff that, or at least he didn't report it to the most rigorous standards that we have today, lots of what he did. And even though he claimed that these people could, these people from Papua New Guinea could identify these facial expressions as the emotions that he hypothesized they would be, these rates were actually much lower than you found for, say, people in America or people in South America, people in Europe. And although they were above significance, you could argue that, for instance, they were helped in certain ways because of certain methodological factors to have like inflated the agreement levels that they had. And so there, you can kind of put aside that research and say, a bit iffy. And then you had the physiological research, which has never been really clear. Like, of course, intuitively, you'd expect that if you feel angry, you have different autonomic activation to when you feel sad, for instance. But it's never been particularly clear-cut. Like, the research is not there to make a strong conclusion. And so I guess that left a gap in the literature for other points of view. Where my research comes in is that essentially you have to look back at the principles and the foundations of Ekman's theory. And he suggests that because we have these universal facial expressions that are adaptive and evolutionary bestowed on us, that we should also be able to recognize those facial expressions almost automatically or unconsciously, automatically, intuitively at a very young age. And he called this process pattern matching. So for instance, we have these prototypical facial displays of emotion. For instance, sadness might be like a pout. And he said if you see the facial muscles, facial features configured in such a way that's representative of a pout, you're going to say that person's sad, for instance. And it's just the pattern matching process. You match the pattern of the face with the stored prototype that you have in your mind, and you're like, oh, that person's sad, that person's happy, that person's scared. Of course, it doesn't quite work that way, and I think maybe any listener here must be thinking, no, there's lots of other factors that affect how we interpret facial expressions. As I said, this was a very long-winded way to get to why my research is important. Because one of these factors is context. In fact, that, I guess it depends how broadly you define context, but it could be anything outside of the face itself. And so many things outside of the face, the facial muscles, the facial features, influence how that expression is interpreted. And essentially, this is where my research comes in. What are the other features that affect how facial expressions are interpreted? How do they affect it? How do they interact with the different facial muscles that are activated? And why, I guess, have we not really considered these to the extent that we perhaps should have done? Would be more of a reflective way of looking at it too.
Yeah. So can you tell about the sort of experiments that happen to determine what these extra features are, that contextual features are that help determine how we detect emotions through faces or something like this? Yeah.
So I guess the standard paradigm would be you have to manipulate something in a psychology experiment, right? And if we're looking at how different contextual factors influence facial expression interpretation, you've got to manipulate the context. Or you can manipulate the face too and see how the different facial expressions interact with one another with the context. Obviously, you've got to manipulate the context. And so you can manipulate the context, you can present different contexts, you can present one context and then just have the face isolated on its own, which is what Ekman did in his early research. One of the problems with it is they only presented static photos of isolated facial expressions that had been posed. So you can present like a posed static expression and then an expression, like a spontaneous expression, or an expression within a more ecologically valid context, and see how the interpretation of the expression changes depending on the context or the lack of context. Obviously, you can just do that on a simple rating scale. So say, I don't know, a Likert scale or a 1 to 100 scale, for instance, and see how different ratings change. You can find effects. So say, if you rated the expression as showing 50 out of 100 on the happiness scale, and you add a context, it's now 70 out of 100, you've got a big effect of context there, right? So that's one way of doing it. Of course, it's more complex than that. And when we go around looking at people's faces in everyday life, we don't say, oh, that person's 50 out of 100 on the happiness scale. It's kind of an arbitrary way of doing it. So you have to think about other paradigms that you can use. You're trying to see how it affects behavior. It's all well and good seeing, oh, that person's rating it differently. But again, because of the way we do experiments in psychology, it could be responding to demand characteristics. They could be using different psychological processes to when they're actually looking at facial expressions in everyday life. So you see, does it affect their behavior either explicitly or implicitly? You can have like approach avoidance paradigms, for instance, where they have to like instinctively, very quickly push something away from them or push it towards them in terms of, do I want to approach this or not? Or you could have things like trust games, almost paradigms that you could get from game theory, for instance, trust games, prisoner's dilemma, and see does it affect how we cooperate with other people, how much we trust them. And then obviously you can make it more ecological. You can have people actually interacting like we are now and seeing how different metrics, different elements of the interaction are affected by what facial expressions are produced. You might tell people to change their facial expressions, or you might change the context. You might say, is this competitive context, is it a cooperative context? How do the facial expressions produced in cooperative context, if we produce them in competitive context, do they have different meanings? Are they perceived in different ways? And so we can do experiments, we can manipulate lots of different aspects of the context, the situation, depending on which paradigm we're using, and then somehow monitor some sort of dependent variable, and basically see what changes there are in the ratings of the facial expression or the responses to the facial expression.
So this leads me to the next question, because it will clarify some of what you said.
Yeah, of course.
And flesh it
It's
out.
quite abstract right now, what I've said, isn't it?
So what are some of the contexts that are determinants in influencing how we perceive emotion in through facial expressions, or or so what are some of these contexts, like so I remember reading about let's say the body or other faces or personality.
Yeah.
So and also and I think some of the experiments had like these neutral faces, and how context or determinant was seen in terms of well, particularly in terms of neutral faces. So can you just speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, of course. So with regards to the types of context, I think even if you just had like a little brainstorm now, the viewer or the listener, and thought, what affects how I perceive facial expressions, you could probably come up with a list of quite a few things. And we can study most of them to some extent, although I will make a point at the end about the difficulties of doing this type of thing. But I guess some people have conceptualized it on different levels. You have types of context that are kind of within the perceiver. This is the most basic thing. If I'm looking at your facial expression now, for instance, hopefully it's not like disgusted, but I'm looking at your facial expression and I'm putting together lots of different information that might affect how I perceive it. But at the end of the day, a huge chunk of how I perceive your facial expression is on me. It's got nothing to do with you. It's my mood. It's what cognitive strain I'm under. It's mood and cognitive load are big ones in particular, but this is factors within myself that are on kind of like a situational level. If I'm angry, then I'm more likely to perceive someone else's facial expression as negative, for instance, or more aggressive. Or if I'm under cognitive load, then maybe my accuracy of facial expression perception is limited or reduced to some extent because we're doing another process, which means we don't have the resources to focus on, say, facial expression perception. And then also, if you think about within the perceiver, you have almost like higher level concepts such as culture. So for instance, I can't vary this within myself, for instance, but we can do experiments where we vary the culture of the perceiver. Okay. And we have differences depending on what part of the world we've been brought up in, for instance, that affect how we perceive facial expressions. And so, for instance, you have this classic dichotomy between Western and Eastern cultures. We mainly test the weird, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic societies. And we have a tendency to see those expressions in some way, in a certain way that maybe people from China and Japan and Korea don't. So the classic example I would say is things like the Duchenne smile, for instance, and how the Duchenne smile is basically where we have crow's feet around the eyes, contraction of a certain muscle produces these crow's feet, the folds around the corner of the eyes, and it's seen as like a marker of genuineness of a smile. And we kind of accept that as being a truth in Western cultures, but it's not really tends to be used in Eastern cultures and Africa, that type of stuff. So the culture affects how we perceive other people's facial expressions, and so you have these factors within the perceiver. But then you also, obviously, the things that people probably thought about straight away were the things associated with you, and not necessarily associated with you in terms of you personally, but the situation that you're in is one of them. Situation is quite a broad name for context, but for instance, right now, the situation that we're in, you could say we're in an interview, that's the situation. We could also say we're in a boardroom, that's also another way people could categorize a situation, or a meeting room, for instance. So the situation is kind of an ambiguous term, but both of those things, the fact we're doing an interview is affecting probably the impressions that I have about why you're producing certain facial expressions, what they mean. Is it just encouraging me, telling me to go on, keep going on, I don't want to speak, I can let Sam continue, because we're in an interview, for instance, and there's like accepted norms and conventions about when to step in, when to start speaking, when to stop speaking, how long to speak for. Or the boardroom, clearly it's quite a formal setting, I'm not going to be necessarily joking around as much as I normally would do. And so all of these things affect how, not necessarily both my interpretations of your facial expressions, but of course the situation that we're in is going to affect how I expect you to behave in these situations, and then affect how I perceive your expressions accordingly. So you have situation, you also have factors within the other person. So for instance, body language is a big one. Right now, like some people sit in more relaxed postures than others, but if you can gain a lot of information from body language. I think it goes without saying. And so, for instance, if you're looking less relaxed, more like rigid, then maybe we're going to say, oh, he's uncomfortable. His facial expression is more like, I don't want to keep talking with Sam because he's boring me. Hopefully not. Or, for instance, eye gaze is another big one, that where you're looking is a really good way of disambiguating certain emotions. So if you're looking directly at me, then, for instance, I'm more likely to think, oh, your facial expression is one of interest. Whereas if you're looking away, it's probably more one of boredom. And if we like expand that up to, again, Ekman's basic emotions, direct gaze at someone is more a sign of anger. Like if you're angry with someone, you're going to be looking at them, making sure they know you're angry. Whereas if you're scared of someone, you're probably likely to be looking away, like, don't come near me, I'm not a threat to you, I'm not going to look at you, I don't want to bother you, for instance. So eye gaze is a big one. And then you just have really low level things, just like what clothes you're wearing. That tells me stuff about you. For instance, obviously certain people wear certain clothes that identify them with certain groups, either consciously or unconsciously. And then we make these judgments about them. Like if you're wearing clothes that maybe signify you as I don't know, this is going to sound really judgmental, but like as like a nerd, then maybe I'm going to think, oh, just by my internal associations between, you know, this very prejudiced view of what nerds are, and like maybe one might think their social interaction isn't quite as on the same level as people who aren't nerds. This is all extremely stereotypical. Then you might say, oh, I'm going to interpret their facial expressions in another way. And you just get this from these very basic, low-level cues about what people are wearing, what their haircut is. And then even like on a higher level than that, you also have things like how well we know you, what you know about your personality. If I think that you're someone I can't trust, then maybe I'm going to view your facial expressions in a completely different way to someone who's like a trusted friend and associate. Because I might think, oh, he's hiding his facial expressions for some ulterior purpose or motive, for instance. If I know that he's, or she's obviously, if I've heard rumours of like certain behaviours or like certain reputations, it's all going to influence how we see the facial expression. And what I've just listed is probably 10 or 11 different things about how we interpret facial expressions. And the point I really want to make is that we're doing this all the time, constantly interacting with people, and all of these different things are getting processed by our brain and getting integrated together and making us come to this percept or idea of what the other person is feeling, what they're thinking, what their intentions are. And we have to integrate this extremely subconsciously, extremely automatically, but we do it all the time to come to this conclusion of what the other person is thinking right now. And that massively limits how well we can study it. Because maybe if I'm doing my own research, I might focus on, say, the situation that they're in. And as I said, even that's a broad term, but say we might vary, are they on a beach? Are they in an office? Are they in a cemetery or whatever? And you can only, it's hard to focus on more than one thing, because as soon as you bring in another thing, you're bringing in another source of variation, you're bringing in more interactions. And it really does hinder psychology in some way, that we don't have the power, because I guess of the intense and immense complexity of social interaction, to really study it in the way that we would need to replicate the social processes that we're currently undergoing.
So, you know, you have there are ambiguous facial expressions, and there are
I should have come on to that. Yeah.
So how do contextual and from what I understood, that it's these contextual factors particularly help us with these ambiguous facial expressions. And I mean, how does that work?
I guess I understand what you're saying. I guess this is kind of logical. So if we're thinking about ambiguous facial expressions, we can think about neutral faces for one would be ambiguous. And I know you asked that in the previous question, and I forgot to touch on it. But context is extremely powerful, because we can see emotion in neutral faces which isn't necessarily there. Or not just emotion, we can see other things in faces that aren't necessarily there when the context influences it. So classically, you'd go back to like Kuleshov. He was a Soviet filmmaker, early 1920s, late 1910s, you know, around the time of the beginning of the Soviet era. And he was a bit of a genius. He was creating these experiments where he would basically splice different clips from films, and then at the end he'd present exactly the same facial expression, exactly the same clip, and his audiences in the cinema, Moscow or whatever, St. Petersburg, would be like taken aback, because in one of the clips they would see someone who's being really hungry because they'd, you know, the way he'd spiced the film, it looked like they really wanted some soup and they didn't get it. They were deprived of food. And another one, they'd be really sad, like they'd see like, you know, the corpse of a child that the mother had seen, for instance, and you'd be like, oh, that person's really sad. And in other ways, you might say, oh, that person is what was the other emotion they did? I can't remember. There was a third emotion as well. I think it might have been interest or something like that, where it was more in terms of, I don't know, some like romantic interest in something. And he would basically get the audience to infer an emotion on a face that was entirely neutral, purely based on the context. People do this in filmography all the time. Hitchcock did it in Rear Window, when you have the man with his telescope looking into different people's rooms in his neighborhood, and then they cut back to the man's face, and his face isn't particularly expressive, but you can tell by what he's looking at. There's that famous scene where he's looking into the room of like an attractive young model, for instance, and you can kind of...
The ballet dancer.
Yeah, the ballet dancer, exactly. Yeah, the ballet dancer. And you can see the... like his face doesn't actually reveal much in terms of the configuration, the features that are aroused, but from the way Hitchcock has filmed it, because he was obviously a student, well, he wasn't a student of Kuleshov, but he knew about Kuleshov and his work, and he was kind of inspired by that in his filming. And so you can see expressions on not expressions. You can see emotions and social intentions on faces purely based on the context. But it does make sense. As I said, it is intuitive, because if we're trying to ascribe beliefs, intentions, desires, emotions on faces, then we do have these different sources of information. We have the face itself, obviously, the most obvious source of information, but then, as I said, we have all these different bits of context. And if the face is less ambiguous, if it's not producing this prototypical expression that Ekman was talking about, that's extremely obviously indicative of fear or surprise or sadness or whatever, then we're more likely to focus on the contextual information, because it's just a clearer source of information. We know from our experience within the social world that if someone is at, I don't know, a football match and their team scored, they're going to be happy, because it's a rule. Like, it's a rule. You're not going to be sad if your team has just scored. And that's a really obvious, clear one. But, you know, we have other rules about, you know, if someone's in a meeting, for instance, they don't want to be in, then maybe they might be hiding the fact that they're bored, but they are bored, for instance. And so we look beyond the facial expression and think we ascribe beliefs to them because of the context. It's just basically the clarity of the source that we're thinking about. If the face as a source is unclear as to what they're feeling, we're going to rely more on other sources to work out what they're feeling. And so if the face is ambiguous or neutral, we're going to rely more on this external source of information to work out what the face is feeling.
Right. So now, since we've discussed the background to your research, can you tell us a little bit more about how your research comes in here and what your research is?
Okay, so my research, first of all, slight disclaimer, not too far down the line at the moment. I'm still only in the second year of my PhD, but essentially the whole point of the project is that we want to expand upon previous research. Obviously, that's what all PhDs do, all DPhils do. And we're looking specifically at smiles. So smiles are a really interesting expression because they're the most frequently seen facial expression, apart from, I guess, you'd say the neutral face, which, whether we call that an expression or not, is up for debate. But they're most frequently seen facial expression within social interactions. And they have all sorts of meanings. So they are, if we go back to the ambiguity thing, smiles are very ambiguous compared to, say, someone who's angry, because we deploy smiles for so many different reasons and in so many different situations. And not just that, we have these different types of smiles, which are very subtly very subtly different from one another in terms of the muscles that are activated in the face. And so because of that, because they're ambiguous, because there's subtle differences between them, because we deploy them in such a huge variety of different social situations, because they're so frequent, they're an extremely interesting facial expression to study. And yet we kind of haven't studied them that much. If you're thinking of smiles, the first person you would think of is Duchenne of Boulogne, who was a neurologist in the 1800s, and he came up with this classification of smiles in which he said we have this Duchenne smile, which, as I said earlier, has been characterized by, you know, crow's feet, these crinkles around the eye, and then you have non-Duchenne smiles which don't have those crow's feet around them. And the first one, the former, is more indicative of, you know, genuine happiness, underlying joy, and the second one is more of like a social smile. It's less authentic, less genuine. You could call it a polite smile or a posed smile, for instance. And we had this again, I'm going to use the word dichotomy again. We had this dichotomy between these two smiles for most of the last 100 plus years in facial expression research. And whilst it was really intuitive and a great model to build research upon, I think anyone listening now or watching now might think it's a bit more complicated than that. And we deploy smiles. We can't just conceive of smiles. First of all, there's more than two types of smiles, obviously. Second of all, characterizing a smile or defining it purely based on the authenticity of it or the genuineness of it relative to, say, an underlying emotion kind of fails to capture these social motives of the smile, the social function that the smile has. So even if we think about a smile as reflecting happiness, which, okay, it's undoubted, I'm not going to deny that we smile when we're happy, we do, although not all smiles reflect happiness, obviously. But when we smile, what is the purpose of that smile within the social interaction? And people have thought about it, and yeah, maybe it correlates with the emotion we experience, but is it really a function of the emotion? And instead, we might think, oh, what's the social role that it has? So, for instance, if I smile because someone has told a joke, the function of the smile isn't necessarily to show that we're happy, because that has no use or no meaning. Yeah. It's to tell the other person who's made the joke, you're making me happy, keep doing what you're doing. It has this social function, almost like a reinforcement function, because we like receiving smiles, and the smile is telling the other person, keep doing it, you're making me happy, you're making me feel pleasure. So you can almost think about a smile at a more higher level of understanding. It's not just showing I'm happy, it is showing I'm happy, but it's also showing I want you to do that again.
Yeah, sorry, I laughed because, I thought of, if somebody tells you a joke and if you just smile dryly like this, it'll be like, look, it wasn't that funny also.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So perfectly case in point, isn't it? And so then we have, say, a more affiliative type of smile. And the affiliation smile is probably most what we would correspond to a non-Duchenne smile. But even within the affiliation smile, the broad category, we can smile affiliatively for so many different reasons. We can smile to reassure someone. We can smile as a smile of greeting, for instance. We can smile in terms of an affiliation smile in extremely sad contexts, to be it's going to be okay. We could smile like that to kind of almost recruit some form of approach from someone else in some way. It has all these functions that are nothing to do with an emotion that's being experienced and nothing to do with the reward either. And then we think obviously of the social functions of these smiles. But as I said, if I think of the affiliation one, imagine you're walking down a street, it's the middle of the night, you're on your own, it's cold, it's dark, and you see someone else walking along the street, especially say if we're saying in a nightclub in the UK or something, and there's someone walking home, and you know that maybe this isn't the time of day, the situation where people are feeling particularly safe. So you might smile at them. It's like, oh, look, I'm not a threat to you. It's like a non-threat display. And ironically, this is kind of where we think smiles evolved from, at least anthropologists. If you're thinking of monkeys, they don't have the same repertoire of facial expressions that we do, but they have what we call the bared teeth display. And it means different things in different monkey species. Even within different macaque species, it has different meanings. But generally, by and large, it's like an appeasement display. It's a sign of, I'm not a threat to you, I'm giving in. I'm not going to intimidate you, I'm not a threat. Let's establish relations, let's establish bonds. So you have this non-threat function of an affiliation smile. You're not doing that because you're happy, which is what people associate smiles with typically. You're doing it for this very social function. And then even beyond that, you have a third type of smile, which Duchenne doesn't even try and cover. And I'm not criticizing Duchenne here, he's an absolute genius. And his research has obviously provided the groundwork for, even now, 150 years on, what we're studying. And he did so much more than just smiles as well. He was the one who was researching muscular dystrophy and so many other neurological conditions. So I'm not belittling him. But then in modern years, we've tried to expand what we think of smiles as doing. And we have these things which we call dominant smiles, which when I think about dominant smiles, I always try and characterize them, or the word that you need to remember with dominant smiles is asymmetry or asymmetrical. And there's two reasons for that. One is that the dominant smile, if we were going to characterize it in terms of the facial muscles that are activated, it only tends to involve the upturning of one corner of the mouth. So we'd say it's almost like a smug smile. It's like that. It's when you're kind of, you know, someone's told a rubbish joke and you're like, you know, you're looking at the other people in the room like not convinced by that type of thing. Or you might do it. I was talking about it. For me, I'm a massive football fan, and I used to play, and we were rubbish. Like, I was bottom of the South Buckinghamshire Junior Football League for Stoke and Church, like 6 years in a row. We got battered every game, and at the end of the game, you'd shake hands with the opposition players as you were walking off, and all of them would have this very smug smile. They just put like 11 goals past you. We lost. I remember one time we lost 23. And I scored 2 of the 3 goals that we scored. It was terrible. But at the end of the game, you would shake the hands of the opposition team members, who were obviously much better footballers than I was and most of my teammates. And they would have this really smug smile. And it's characterised by an upturn of one corner of the mouth. But I think that expression, that example is perfect when I go back to asymmetry, because the other reason we use that word, asymmetry, is because there's asymmetrical relations between the person who's smiling and the person they're smiling at. In that situation, the victor is clearly on like a higher social status than the loser. Like, I was always the loser, but the victor is clearly on a higher social status, and it's like, look, I'm better than you. And there's asymmetry in terms of the position they're in within that social situation, so there's like a hierarchy as such. And so the word I would use to describe it is asymmetrical, because you have this asymmetrical facial and morphological activation, and the asymmetry in terms of the social relations between the two people receiving and expressing the smile. So we have all sorts of different smiles. These are just 3. These are the 3 we work with, and they're from like a framework that was developed in 2010. It's the leader author is Paul Niedenthal, who's at university in Wisconsin, and then there's also Ursula Hess, who's at Humboldt. These are 2 huge names in the field, and they kind of tried to develop this model. They had other motivations too, but it's been expanded upon over the last decade or so. And this is what we use in our research. But even Ekman or other researchers have said we do have these different types of smiles. And it's not necessarily reflective of happiness. But we're using this smile classification system, and we're seeing, okay, people haven't really focused on different types of smiles in terms of their social functions. And people definitely haven't focused on different types of smiles in terms of how context affects how they're perceived, even though this is what happens in social interactions all the time. As I said, we see smiles more often than any other facial expression, and context is always affecting how we see facial expressions. No one's really looked at it. So this is where my research comes in. There's been maybe 2 or 3 studies that have looked at this, maybe 4, and they've all been limited in some way. So for instance, and I say limited again, I don't want to mean this I'm not meaning this in an insulting way. They're like the foundations of what we're doing. But for instance, the context they present could be vignettes, they could be sentences, and you see just a picture of someone and you say, this person's just been told their grand's died, or this person's just been told that they've won the lottery. And then you're meant to judge the facial expression. And of course, it's a way of manipulating the context and judging how the smile is perceived, but it's not particularly ecologically valid. And then you have another study. There was one done a couple of years ago, and they do more than just present these, verbal context. They have situational context, which is what we're trying to do. So they present maybe a smiling face within like someone on a beach eating an ice cream, and another one in like a more formal situation, such as a pharmacy or an office, that type of thing. And of course, the smile is viewed as more genuine in the beach situation and less genuine in the office situation. But again, the stimuli are limited to some extent because they're presenting these static photos of facial expression, static photos of the background, and they're only really rating it on one dependent variable, which is genuineness. And when we think of genuineness, again, it's hard to escape this view that it's linked to an emotion in some way, how genuine it is relative to an underlying emotion, which is happiness, of course. And so what we're trying to do is we're looking at not just one type of smile. No study really has compared context effects across different types of smiles. And as I said, you wouldn't really expect them to. There's been very little literature on this. So first of all, we're looking at how context effects vary across smile types. Second of all, we're looking at more ecologically valid stimuli. So we're using situational context that are video-based. We're using facial expressions that are dynamic, ongoing, that unfold over time. And so when you present, this is one of Ekman's flaws in his research. He only presented these still prototypical facial expressions. And of course, when I see your facial expressions now, or the cameraman's, then they unfold dynamically over time. And this gives us far more information about the facial expression. If someone's smiling, but we only have a snapshot of the smile, it gives us very limited information. You could reach that same state of that muscle activation. But in one case, it might be a really slow, drawn-out smile, and you're kind of thinking, like, he's not really feeling happy. He's kind of just, mocking me in some way. And another one, if it really quickly unfolds across the face, then it's kind of a marker of it being more genuine, for instance. And so we lose lots of information by only presenting static facial expressions. We lose lots of information by only presenting static context because it's not really realistic or vivid or ecological. So we're presenting these vivid, dynamic facial expressions, vivid, dynamic context behind them, so it looks almost like a film, and then seeing not just how participants rate the genuineness of the smile, that is one of the measures we use, but also things like, how do you rate this on a politeness scale? How do you rate this on a superiority scale? How do you rate this in terms of, is this person enjoying himself, that type of stuff, but not just happiness, but like the joy he's deriving from the situation. And you can see the interactions between the context and the different facial expressions because we're presenting different types of smiles, for instance, and different types of context. We can have like positive, negative, neutral context, and seeing are certain smiles more influenced by polite context, are certain smiles more influenced by negative context, that type of thing. The paper hasn't come out yet, but we're working on it. It's near completion, near submission. And then also we did like a reverse of that study where we're looking at not just how does the context affect the smile, but also how does the smile affect how the situation is perceived. And again, you might not have thought of this so far as we're discussing facial expressions. But of course, in any situation, the facial expressions of other people affect how we perceive the situation itself. If I walk into a room and everyone's looking really glum, I'm like, oh, something bad has happened here. If I walk into a room and everyone's happy, I'm like, oh, something good has happened here. And it doesn't change anything about the situation or the surroundings or the fact we're in a boardroom or in an interview. But the facial expression itself changes how the situation is perceived. And this is you can kind of link it to appraisal theories. I don't want to get too much into that. It's not really my own research area. But of course, facial expressions within a situation give additional information about the situation itself. And again, there's been not very much research on this, maybe 2, 3, 4 studies. And so we did the converse. We got people to rate situations on their own, and then we got them to rate situations with different smile types in, and did the smiles affect how the situation was perceived? And it did. Of course, if someone smiles genuinely, the situation is perceived as more positive, more enjoyable, less polite actually, less competitive and confrontational. And yet, if we see it with like a dominant smile, then you find exactly the reverse. These are relatively small effects, but they're there. And interestingly, we do find interactions in terms of, for instance, in negative situations, the effect of different smile types is less obvious to distinguish between, and we can come up with different theories for that. But essentially, it seems that the smile is less powerful in negative situations, or at least different smile types are less powerful in terms of how we perceive the situation. And you could say, oh, it's because it's negative, and so therefore we pay less attention to the smile because we're more concerned by the situation itself, and therefore we find it harder to distinguish between the smiles. Or you could say, because it's negative, it's just so unambiguous what the situation is, the smile has less power, for instance. So there's different interpretations of these results, but this is what we're doing. This is kind of as a building block that we build the rest of the DPhil on, because we're basically, our overall question is how to morphological, so different muscular activations that affect how facial features are configured. So how do morphological and contextual cues combine together to affect processing during social interaction? And so far we can look at rating scales, but then in the future we're planning this study where we look at behavioural measures. So as I said, we get people to to interact with like these facial stimuli that we've created in some way, and then do like an approach avoidance task, as I said. Would I approach this person in this context, or would I avoid them? Or we get them to say how much money would I invest in them, and how much would I expect them to give me back based on the facial expression that they're producing, for instance. And then beyond that, obviously, we're gradually increasing the ecological validity of the studies. First of all, we go from just ratings, then we go, does it affect behaviour? And then we actually would try and put different people in a room together to interact with one another, again, as we are now, and see how that affects perceptions of other people and their facial expressions and their cooperation, for instance. But obviously that's a bit further down the line, but that would be the end goal, and seeing if the findings that we've made in less ecological, less interactional research then translate to actual face-to-face interactions.
Right. So we spoke about, I mean, in you had 2 classes on autism.
I did, yeah.
And we were wondering, I mean, there was a question in the class also, but I thought it was a very interesting question about the relation of autism with some of this, emotion perception research, right?
Yeah.
And how would autism, how would people with autism Would they have deficiencies with contextual, inferring emotion based on context, or how would they kind of relate in this sort of, in terms of perceiving emotion?
So I think autism is a really interesting condition, especially with regards to my research, which more looks at neurotypical stuff. I originally did want to study autism on my DPhil, but I think it's maybe a bridge too far. But so autism, first of all, I'm saying I'm not an expert in it, but I do have some background in it to some extent. And before I go into it any further, I'd caveat by saying that autism is an extremely heterogeneous condition in terms of, like, one autistic person could be completely different from another autistic person. So this isn't true for everyone. But having said that, you would expect there to be some sort of deficits in social interaction and facial expression perception in particular. There has been some research showing this. I don't want to go too much into that. If we're looking at context effects in facial expression perception, then I think it's likely that you would find reduced context effects in autistic people. They're less likely to integrate external additional information into how they process facial expressions. And you could argue this is for two main reasons, or two main theories perhaps. One would be that people have proposed that autistic people, when they go through social interaction, they kind of have these compensatory strategies because they struggle a lot with social interaction. That's one of the key, behavioural symptoms that lead to diagnosis of autism. And one line of thought suggests that because they struggle with social interaction, and we do it quite naturally, as I said, we have to integrate all of this different information at all times. It's quite a complex process. They struggle with it. So instead, to cope with what is a very complex process where you have to infer the intentions, emotions of other people, they have these verbal rules, these very rigid rules almost, to help them deal with the complexity. So for instance, it might be, if the mouth is upturned, then they're smiling. Obviously, that is a smile. Then they're happy, for instance. It's a very simple, rule-based way of getting through social situations. And to some extent, that does help, because in various situations, if someone is smiling, they are happy. And it prevents, the sensory overload, or the overload of information, as I said, very complex processing in social interaction. But in other ways, obviously, it isn't helpful, because not all the time when someone smiles are they happy. In fact, as we've discussed, we smile for so many other different reasons, and we might be missing out on these subtleties within social interaction. So that's one side of the coin, that they might deal with social interaction with these rule-based strategies. I guess the flip side of the coin is that as well as these rules, they also fail to integrate the contextual information for different reasons. So we have this theory that's becoming more and more prominent in the autism field, which is kind of like the Bayesian or predictive coding theory of autism. And again, without going too much into the details or the maths behind it, it basically implies that when we process anything, and this is true of neurotypical people as well, that we always have to integrate both top-down knowledge, expectations of the world, and the bottom-up sensory information that's coming to our vision, our ears, our touch, and all this sensory information is coming in, and it kind of comes up into the brain, and it gets combined or integrated with top-down expectations about the world. And this explains loads of different features in psychology, pop psychology. So visual illusions, we see what we expect to see. In terms of depth perception, we see depth, partly because of the stereo vision that we have, the binocular vision, but also partly because that's what we expect to see. It's another reason we see depth in paintings and photos, even though it's obviously a 2D surface. And we have these top-down expectations about the world. Of course, it's not just perception, it also helps with social interaction as well. If we have this expectation, we talked about it, it's just a type of context. If we have a knowledge of the other person's personality or the social conventions within a situation, then it's used, obviously, which is integrated with the sensory information, the language, for instance, that we hear, the body language that we see. And it's integrated, our knowledge of what that body language means, what the rules are in that situation, is integrated with the sensory information that we get. And in typical people, we integrate this quite well, as I said. We interact well during social interactions. And it's obviously, there's a spectrum, there's a continuum within autism, some are better than others. But the argument is that perhaps the influence of this top-down knowledge is attenuated or reduced for autistic people, and they rely more on the sensory information. This explains not just the sensory features of autism. You know, there's often hypo or hyper reactivity to sensory input, and potentially, you know, things like the insistence on sameness and the repetitive behaviours could be linked to this increased what's the word? Increased emphasis placed on sensory information relative to top-down information. But also it could explain, you know, the social interaction deficits as well, because if we're not integrating these you know, quite well defined, quite well accepted you know, ideas and knowledge about the world when we're interacting with people, then we're going to miss out on some of the subtle ambiguities of a social situation. And so, as I said, the flip side of the coin is perhaps autistic people, for that reason, won't integrate this contextual information when they're processing facial expressions or other emotional and social stimuli, as I said, like body language. And there hasn't been too much research on this. There's been little bits. So there was a study done in 2007, I think in Japan. I think the reference is Akachi et al. And I found it really interesting because we talked about earlier how eye gaze plays a role in modulating how we perceive facial expressions. And in fact, there's been studies around that time which basically presented two facial expressions that were identical. They were ambiguous morphs of angry and scared faces from the prototypical expressions. And in one, they photoshopped it so that the gaze was like averted, it was looking away from the viewer, and in the other, it was direct gaze. And when the gaze was direct, as you'd expect, the participants saw it more as reflecting anger, and when it was averted, they saw it more as reflecting fear. These neurotypical participants. This study that happened maybe a year or two later with autistic participants, comparing them to these controls, found that they didn't gain this benefit of averted eye gaze in terms of their like emotional attributions towards the facial expression. And maybe they're not taking in this expectation about the world that, for instance, if we avert our gaze, then we're more likely to be fearful. I guess it's strange when I say this because, as I said, sometimes they have rules to help them get through social situations, and this could be a rule. Like this top-down knowledge might be a rule, but I guess the problem is sometimes they don't have rules that they should have, and sometimes the rules don't apply all the time, for instance. And so they might have these rigid top-down rules, but by and large, they don't apply this top-down knowledge as much as perhaps they should do. Remember, caveat, that autism is extremely variable, and this isn't the case for everyone. But this theory is gaining prominence, and maybe it's another reason why we might expect that in autistic people, they're not integrating the contextual information as well. Or maybe it's simply that they're just overwhelmed by all of the different things that we mentioned, the situation, the body language, the eye gaze, the clothes, the how well we know someone, what we know about their personality, a past history of interactions. It's just such a complex thing that they just stop relying on it altogether, and it's easier just to focus on the face itself. Or they only focus on one of those things and ignore the others, for instance. So there is this idea that there's a reduced reliance on the top-down information, and maybe this is the flip side of the coin as to why perhaps the facial expression recognition and that type of stuff is perhaps not as typical in autistic people as it is in neurotypical people.
Thank you so much, Samuel. It was wonderful having you with us. It was wonderful interviewing you.
It's been a pleasure. I love India, I love Bangalore, I love Alliance University. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I loved having this conversation. Awesome. All the best with your thesis, with your future.
I'll try my best. Yeah, no, thank you so much as well.